So let's talk through a tier list of the Unforgiven with what's looking stronger and weaker for the Dark Angels in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking through a tier list for the Knights of Caliban, weighing up some of the strongest and weakest units for the Dark Angels. Since the past points updates, the Dark Angels haven't really been doing all that well in terms of tournament stats and win rates and things. Their overall tournament win rate was around about 43% or so last time I checked, so certainly one of the lowest in the game there. Though their game balance does seem to be in a bit of a weird place at the moment. Basically, they still seem to be having top tournament success with a Space Marine Ironstorm list, usually just using exactly 2 Dark Angels datasheets. A few people managing to do at least okay in tournaments with some more standard Space Marine detachments and the mainline Dark Angels units, things like their Terminators and bikes, accompanying Gladius, Vanguard, or Firestorm perhaps. Though for the most part it just seems to be fairly agreed that the Codex detachments just aren't really all that strong. I feel like the Company of Hunters and the Inner Circle Task Force have more going for them versus the Unforgiven one. But in general, since the book has come out, not many people have been playing with them in any sort of competitive sense, and most people who have been haven't really seen much notable success. With all that context in mind though, for this video I thought I'd do a rough tier list of power level of the Dark Angels units, mainly focusing on their unique ones in their codex, though I'll just do a quick highlight overview of where I've ranked the other Space Marine units, which will be kind of similar to how I placed them on my previous tier list. I might mention a few highlights for the core codex, but if you want a bit more detail on that, I did talk about them a bit more in my more general Space Marine tier list, done a few weeks back now. I'll link that in the video description. Finally, as ever with 40k tier lists, they are certainly a bit arbitrary depending on your own army meta and playstyle. Certain units could be better or worse than ranks here by any one person, and as mentioned, detachments do have an absolute huge effect on which units are good or not, and would have their own tweaked tier list. I'll certainly talk a bit about Dark Angel's Ironstorm things versus other detachments, as that seems to be the biggest skew here. In any case though, we'll aim to go through 5 rough tiers of Dark Angels and other Space Marine units ranked for power, starting them with the weakest and going forward to the strongest. Just before we jump into that though, I thought I'd just talk about the all very Unforgiven sponsor for this video in DakkaDakka.Store, a 3D printing creator who wanted to sponsor some Dark Angels content to tie in with a brand new miniature range that they're launching on Kickstarter today, with their new range called Black Lions. They're an experienced 3D printing store that often makes models that are very compatible with the Warhammer 40k setting, miniature sculpts that are different enough to be legally distinct, but still might bear enough resemblance to be used in games as near proxy miniatures, in this case exo-armoured super soldiers in monastic hoods and robes and things. It appears to have just gone live on the Kickstarter as I'm recording this, so a fair few more details there if you want to check out the link in the video description, but the idea is there's about 350 odd STLs making 100 unique miniatures, split between Black Lions and Noctis Horrors, the latter maybe a bit more Night Lords in flavour perhaps. For previous projects they've done a good number of characters, infantry types and vehicles, so it should be fun to see what they have to come for this one. In any case, if you did want some Unforgiven themed STLs and bits, the core themed offering they have are the Black Lions Knights of the Circle, some nice robed bodies and legs there, and some winged helms with plenty of hoods. A few different options for some on-theme backpacks and different weapon options, lots of dual-wielding blades that maybe could be used as inner circle companions perhaps. There's a few themed pauldrons and some shields and swords. I feel like shields are quite a nice place for displaying heraldry, kind of fun compared with the generic ones. And they've got a couple of character miniatures as well, including this one named Richard the Lionheart. Good search engine optimization on that guy, I guess. A pretty cool monastic power armoured model with a winged helm. And another character miniature called a Justiciar, this one equipped with a sword slung across his back and a relic pistol. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this video, and hopefully some of you Unforgiven collectors out there might find the STL bits useful for adding a bit more theme. I'll leave a link to the Kickstarter project down in the video description. Let's jump into the tier list proper though, and in tier 5 we have the ones I consider the weakest datasheets. For this one I've chosen not to rank any actual Dark Angels units quite this far down, though I feel like some were sort of nosing that way. And as with the Space Marines I've just kept it for the Hammerfall bunker and the Thunderhawk gunship. The Hammerfall is just overcosted for what it does for a stationary gun turret without that much threat, and the Thunderhawk's just a bit too big and high investment for most gaming purposes. If you're paying like 800 plus points on a model, then it needs to be truly impactful. I don't think the Thunderhawk gunship quite gets there on its raw stats. Moving swiftly on to tier 4, and we've got some actual Dark Angels. I'd consider these to be fairly overshadowed by other options in the Codex though. First up, for 70 points, we've got Master Lazarus, the first Primaris Dark Angel. He's a Space Marine Captain or Company Master type profile, with at least a fair amount of melee threat, 6 attacks at Strength 6, AP 3 and Damage 2 with Anti-Psyker, a 3+ Feel No Pain save against psychic attacks and mortal wounds, and he grants 4+ to fight on death for his own units. I feel like if you really want to use him, he will add some value. He just feels really quite matchup specific. If you're playing against Grey Knights or Thousand Suns with psychic attacks and mortal wounds flying everywhere, then he is going to have good value. If you're not, then he's probably going to be much worse than many of the other choices that you could have had to lead, say Blade Guard Veterans or Inner Circle Companions. I guess Thousand Suns and Grey Knights are unusually powerful right now, so he might be a bit of a counter-meta choice. But still, in the majority of tournament games of 40k that you might play in currently, I just don't think he's going to have much value compared with other choices. Otherwise, I've chosen to rank the Nephilim Jet Fighter down here as well, maybe slightly below the Dark Talon. It is the cheaper of the two at 195 points, and for that you get 2 las cannons, 2 mid-strength missile shots, and a twin heavy bolter. It is a bit tougher than some flyers out there, with -1 to hit it built in, and also -1 to wound for fly units. Overall, just neither its damage nor defense is particularly exciting in my opinion. It's both low damage compared with other Space Marine vehicles, and still low durability despite a -1 to hit. Really not too hard to take down with most units for 200 points. I think you're just likely going to be better with on-the-board armour, or maybe Storm Raven gunships, which aren't actually all that many more points in, say, an Ironstorm list. Finally ranked down here is the Landspeeder Vengeance at 140 points. This one I think just still needs a really big points cut. It just really doesn't look good when you put it next to any of the other Space Marine tanks and vehicles that you could get for a very similar points cost. Its Plasma Storm Battery gets you D6+1, Strength 9, AP3 and Damage 2 attacks with twin links. It's definitely not nothing and will genuinely chip away at things like 2 wound Space Marines quite well. But for 140 points you can have some very threatening Space Marine vehicles out there. Stuff that can damage heavy armour a lot easier, and they also tend to have more defense as well. 10 wounds at toughness 8 just isn't that much for 140 points, even with the invulnerable save. For positives, I guess, it can also get an assault cannon. It's quite fast and has that return fire sort of mechanic if you kill something close to it. I feel like with its fragility though, it might just be more tempting just to destroy this speeder first. It feels like a bit of an easy win to try and take out with lots of mid-strength weapons. Anything that's like Strength 8 or Strength 9 will have much more fun against this than against tough armour. Otherwise, here's the list of other things that I ranked down here in my previous Codex Space Marine tier list. I've got things like Reavers that just don't have much threat, overcosted things like the Desolation Squad. Maybe the Invader ATV could have a bit more luck in the company of hunters perhaps, though I still think it's a bit awkward only being able to field one of them in a unit. Perhaps a few of them could have a little bit more use with certain other Dark Angels units in combo, perhaps having an Ancient to bear the Penitent of Remembrance in Unforgiven task force if you were set on using that, or an Apothecary could help out Hellblasters when paired with Azrael. I'd say that some of these could be usable when backed up by a strong list if you're playing more casually, but are going to be very rare sights indeed in any sort of competitive army. If you'd like a bit more discussion on these, then check out my full Space Marine tier list. Moving onwards and upwards to Tier 3, these are units I consider a bit more usable but maybe not crazily standout, a bit more interest to the datasheets in my opinion versus the ones that are ranked in the previous tier, though I still say that all of these aren't really likely to be optimal in competitive lists and don't have as much excitement as the stuff that I placed in Tier 2 or Tier 1. First up, I think that given the points cut to 90 points, the Inner Circle Companions aren't quite as bad as some people might make out. At their launch points of 105 points, they'd have easily been Tier 4 and maybe Tier 5, but at 90 points they do have some threat. 4 attacks each with Strength 6, AP 1 and Damage 2 and lethal hits isn't completely awful for a 30-point model, but the biggest weakness is they just have that low AP, which means if they're fighting enemy Space Marines with access to Armour of Contempt or something, they really are going to fall flat. I'd say they're a lot more usable in an army like the Gladius Task Force when they have the chance for extra AP with a stratagem. Otherwise, for advantages of their units, they can swap to a sweep attack if they want some sustained hits against hordes, which isn't too bad in the age of orcs being around. They get an inbuilt +1 to hit against enemy character units, and a -1 to hit if they have a character attached to them, so they can be just a little bit harder to take out than you might expect. I'd say perhaps their main downside though is that they'll get compared to Blade Guard, which get better AP and a 4+ invulnerable save built in. They might not have quite as good special rule backup and no lethal hits, but they still get some rerolls, and I feel like that AP is quite a big deal for them. The Inner Circle companions also unfortunately copy the Blade Guard in having their awkward 3 and 6 squad size, which means that they won't be efficient in impulsors, which otherwise might be a good option. In general, I really feel like they should have had more AP in the Codex. It just seems weird to have fancy power swords that don't have at least AP too. But failing that, I think they need to cost a bit less. Maybe something like 85 points to 80 points could genuinely have people looking at them with interest. They can put out some fairly fearsome volume attacks and do have some nice supporting rules. Next up, maybe with a slightly shaky ranking here, is the Dark Talon at 210 points. I've probably been weighing this up between Tier 3 and Tier 4. It is really quite a big investment flyer, though it does come with a fairly savage main gun, D3 plus 1 shots at strength 16, AP 4 and damage 3 with blast and devastating wounds, plus 24 twin-linked hurricane bolter shots don't hurt. Should hopefully account for a full squad of enemy light infantry each turn. The reason I feel like it's maybe a bit more interesting than the Nephilim is to back up that firepower. It's got genuinely interesting bomb effects. Having a chance to make an enemy unit have to remain stationary in a turn is kind of massive. That could be oddly game changing against the right unit at the right time. You do have to get close enough to use it and play pretty recklessly with your flyer if you're going to. Between that and okay damage output, I've rated it here. I'd still be most concerned about it just being really quite easy to take down in return though. Its defensive profile really isn't good for 210 points, particularly compared with all the other efficient Space Marine armor that you can get. Next up, we've got Grandmaster Belial at 85 points. The Grandmaster of the Deathwing has a really fun new miniature, though his rules are just maybe a bit awkward and niche, giving precision to his Terminator unit. Against some armies that can be massive, particularly things with big strong units with leaders, particularly leaders that are fragile enough to die to a bunch of Stormbolter fire. Plus an okay fighty stat line, and when he actually gets attacked himself, he can bounce some mortal wounds back. I feel like at the moment he's a choice that you could bring along if you really want to counter certain matchups. Maybe trying to take down Technomancers out of a group of Wraiths, or Pain Boys out of an Orc Green Tide. But against a lot of armies, it's just not going to be all that impactful, and I feel like for the most part you're probably best off with a Terminator character that's going to reliably help out the unit against every army that you go up against. Next up, we've got Samael at 130 points, and I feel like at this points cost he's not really very well balanced versus everything that the Ravenwing command squad can offer. He definitely does have some fun stuff though, a plasma cannon in shooting, some nice strength 6 AP3 and damage 2 melee with sustained hits too. He forces desperate escape tests on the enemy, which is genuinely disruptive, and he gives his squad advanced shoot and charge, and that's really good with Black Knight. The main problem with that is that you can often access that kind of easily with other things. Most of the detachments that are actually best used for the Black Knights might already be able to access that in some way, like Gladius Company of Hunters or maybe Stormlance. It does feel like his best buff is perhaps a bit detachment specific. Overall though, just for the amount that he brings for the same price as the command squad, it just feels like they add more. 12 wounds worth of bike, more plasma weapons, and lots of different buffs for the units. I feel like realistically he should cost a fair bit less than them. Maybe more like 100 to 110 points might see him a lot more interesting. Next up, we've got Master of Repentance Asmodai for 70 points. Interrogator Chaplain-in-Chief of the Dark Angels, gives his squad reroll hit rolls in melee, and has a fairly fighty Crozius with AP-2 rather than AP1, plus an optional sweep mode if he wants to put that power sword to work. On top of that, he has Leadership 5+, and a few anti-character rules that maybe feel a little bit peripheral in my opinion. I feel like he's kind of similar to Ezekiel in that I'd rate him as a merely okay choice to lead a melee squad like Blade Guard or Inner Circle Companions. But even in those units, which I wouldn't class as auto-include in any way for the Dark Angels, he's competing against a whole bunch of other good characters, including the Lieutenant, Captain, Chaplain and Judas here, all of which have buffs that you might value more, particularly the Lieutenant and the Chaplain, which can help the squad punch up better against tough things, whereas this guy makes them a bit better against infantry or horde type units. For that reason, I'd rate him a little bit lower down the list, though realistically I don't think he's significantly worse than these if you want to make him work. Finally, one other thing that I should mention about characters like Ezekiel, Asmodai and Lazarus are they can give the Inner Circle keyword to a bunch of different units if you happen to be playing Inner Circle Task Force. Could mean that you could get some interesting damage buffs and a bit more stratagem access for some of the more Green Wing main Dark Angels battle line. It does rather depend on you choosing that detachment and it actually being strong enough to justify it overall though. I'd say the same things about Ezekiel really. He is 5 points more and feels like he's in a similar sort of place. His buff is to give +1 attack for an Inner Circle or Blade Guard unit. On paper at least maybe a slightly weaker buff than Asmodai, though there's not much in it. Beyond that, his other thing is a single, somewhat powerful psychic sniping shot. If you roll hot, you could potentially one-shot most support characters in a single roll. You can hand out a battle shock test, gives you a 4+ feel no pain against psychic, and again feels like you'd want to go with the same sort of units, maybe Blade Guard or Inner Circle companions, competing against all the other good choices. Otherwise, here are the units that are ranked here for more general Codex Space Marines, things I consider kind of more usable and have their own niche in their own way, but again tend to be at least somewhat rare sights in competitive lists, at least compared with all the other choices on offer. I did bump up a couple of the more Dark Angel specific datasheets to higher tiers versus my Space Marine tier list, and maybe as another one that's worthy of note is the Blade Guard Ancient. He's cheap and gives a +1 attack once per game to the Blade Guard squad, plus a bit of OC, and could be used to bear that pennant of remembrance to give them feel no pain in the Unforgiven task force. Moving onwards and upwards in tier 2, here we have a bunch of the units that really should be the best of the Dark Angels, and after the last set of points changes, I feel like Games Workshop did put them in a place where people are occasionally using them competitively. In reviewing a whole bunch of high placing Dark Angels lists for this video, admittedly there was more Iron Storm than anything else, but literally all of these units have been used in at least one high placing Dark Angels list, often using Gladius or one of the other more generic Space Marine detachments, more so than unique Dark Angel stuff unfortunately. I feel like in a more balanced detachment all of these are pretty usable right now. I feel like the points changes made the Deathwing and Lionel Johnson in particular far more appealing. First up, we've got the Deathwing Knights, which feel far more balanced at 215 points versus 235, given that their melee weapons took a big hit in terms of damage output. For 215 points, they are a pretty immensely tanky unit, 4 wounds each due to the storm shields, and -1 damage for their special rule, and even a once per game 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds, which is rather good seeing as that's probably the best way to kill them for the most part. I guess mass devastating wounds might make them kind of sad, but beyond that you do need a fairly spectacularly high damage weapon to kill one of these in a single shot. You need 5 damage per hit to take out a knight from full health. In melee, they get a whole bunch of accurate attacks, weapon skill 2+ with either 4 or 5 attacks depending on their main loadout. Not particularly high strength or high damage weapons for the majority of them, but they will do very well against sort of medium and heavy infantry. And the Deathwing Knight Master actually makes up a large portion of the entire squad's overall damage, just having a much more general purpose weapon with some volume attacks. I still rate them as generally pretty threatening against infantry type units, but aren't going to be as nice as you might hope against monsters and vehicles. At 215 points though, I think they're quite an interesting unit for characters to lead them and enhancements. You could have a chaplain for +1 to wound potentially, or a captain to give you some free stratagems and charge rerolls. And if you are going down the Inner Circle task force route, then they can be a fairly central unit if you're using that with a +1 to wound on offer there. Otherwise, Deathwing Terminators are 5 points more than the standard Loyalist Terminators at 180 per 5 or 360 per 10. They're a good bit cheaper than they were at Codex launch, though Terminators for more standard Space Marines still seem to be in a bit of a mid spot really. Quite a strong and usable unit casually, but not really being seen as optimal enough to make their way into most competitive lists given how big an investment they are. The Deathwing version does feel like a solid upgrade though. They pay 5 points more per 5 of them, but for that you get inbuilt ignores modifiers, which is really nice, and also a once per game 4+ save against mortal wounds from the Watcher. Between those 2 extra rules, I think that's easily worth the extra 5 points. Again, I rate them as useful enough to build around. I think I slightly prefer the Deathwing Knight datasheet out of the 2, though maybe not by all that much. Next up, we've got the fast-moving bikers of the Ravenwing Black Knights, 90 points per 3 of them, or 180 per 6. I think they've got quite a good balance of damage, defense, and mobility. They move quite quickly, though the mounted keyword does mean they have to go around terrain. And if they can get close, they've got 3 attack plasma weapons on those plasma talons, plus a whole bunch of power weapons that gain anti-keywords on the charge. Given being fast and at least fairly hard-hitting, I wouldn't say their defense is terrible either. 3 wounds at toughness 5 with a 5+ invulnerable save isn't enormous, but it's not completely dire for a fast attack unit either. In general, they need to make sure that they move really fast and get the alpha strike on the enemy rather than the other way round. They're pretty nice with anything that can give them advance and shoots like Gladius, Firestorm, or Company of Hunters, and they could get some interesting enhancements out of those detachments out of the Ravenwing Command Squad. I feel like if you're going all in on a Black Knight unit, then the Ravenwing Command Squad are the ones that you'd want to lead them. If you get 6 Black Knights though, it's really quite a big all-in unit at 410 points base plus any enhancements. For this though, you'd have 9 bites with plasma talons, and each of the command squad bikers are 4 wounds each, which is pretty big. It is pretty cool to get sort of character profile models within a unit, but not actually have to give up on extra bodies. The Apothecary allows you to resurrect a model per turn, which is really big when it's 30-point Black Knights, and you can be taking a unit that's kind of hard to take down in one turn. The Champion adds a bit of fight with his damage 2 power weapon. Gives you free heroic intervention if that's useful, and a +1 to advance and charge, which is kind of nice. An extra OC on the banner does mean they have a whole load of OC for one unit. Pretty big for something that can move so fast. Overall, they add up to a unit that can move really fast, bear entrency enhancements, and hit really hard, though for the points when the enemy comes to hit back, they are going to take a lot of damage fast. They could be pretty interesting in Gladius Task Force with Fire Discipline. You can get a pretty obscene amount of plasma shots in Devastator Doctrine with them and the Oath of Moment there, or any of the Alpha Strike style ones from Company of Hunters. They've got multiple different ways to deliver a unit to strike the enemy before they get hit themselves, which is exactly what they want to do. Overall, I feel like they're an interesting unit. Maybe when you go just all in on the investment though, they can still maybe be in a place where they jump out, do a lot of damage, but not quite 400 points worth, and then get taken down in return. Finally, for the units that are ranked at tier 2 for the Dark Angels, we've got Lionel Johnson at 300 points, so much better than when he was 350, which I thought was really quite overcosted at Codex launch. Looking through Dark Angels lists that have done well outside of the Iron Storm, a couple of people have indeed decided to run the Primarch into battle. He certainly could be an intimidating model to see on the other side of the table. Lone operative style protection if he's near infantry, which means he's hard to take down, a good invulnerable save, and just being quite tanky overall, even if you can manage to get shots on him, and fights first in melee, so charging him usually isn't a good idea unless you've got something that is obscenely tanky. He does have pretty huge melee with 8 attacks at strength 12, AP 4 and damage 4, which pretty much nothing in the game is going to be particularly happy to go against, and he can sweep as well against hordes. Otherwise, he's got inbuilt Deep Strike and some aura abilities that can mess with command points or boost nearby Dark Angel's melee threat, though I feel like the auras are maybe a bit weak or niche compared with, say, Gilliman's. And he could potentially do weird shenanigans like pair him with a combi weapon lieutenant, which means both of them would have lone operative at range, and means that you can't just shoot the infantry and then shoot him. Overall, he's a massive investment, big threat that does need to be played kind of carefully, making sure he doesn't die too easily, but also doesn't sit out the game too much. I feel like with Primarchs like this, they're maybe a bit more impactful perhaps in casual games than competitive when people just really struggle to deal with them. They would rate him as usable in competitive and casual, just maybe not crazily stand out for the cost. Otherwise for tier 2, here are all the other Space Marine units I've chosen to rank here. Maybe some more notable ones for the Dark Angels are things like Assault Intercessors, which could be a good guard for Azrael in particular. Given how cheap and well they work with characters, I'd probably put Assault Intercessors borderline tier 1. Stern Guard could also be an interesting enough pick for Azrael, a sort of medium threat veteran unit if you didn't want to shell out for Hellblasters. Outriders are cheaper and tougher than Black Knights and could be interesting in company of Hunters, though I'd probably rate the Black Knights as a bit stronger overall, and the Terminator Ancient could be interesting in Dark Angels more so than others, helping out the Terminator units where he could join alongside a captain, and again could take Pennant of Remembrance in the Unforgiven task force. Otherwise, loads of other generic Space Marine units that are really quite usable at the moment. I put things here like Intercessors with sticky objectives, Aggressors, which could be big power combos out of Land Raiders in some detachments, some of the big transports, and gun tanks that maybe aren't quite as regularly used in Ironstorm, and a bunch of other decent supporting characters as well. Finally though, and getting on to Tier 1, here are the 2 units I've chosen to rate highest for the Unforgiven right now. Very unsurprisingly, Azrael, who really is in a league of his own, and given how ubiquitous it is in Dark Angels Ironstorm, I've also put the Dark Shroud here, though that is assuming in that detachment. If it wasn't in Ironstorm, I'd probably put it Tier 2. I'm sure Azrael doesn't need much explaining to Dark Angels players at this point, just rather godly for his all-round utility. 1 command point generated per turn is pretty awesome on its own and makes up a good chunk of his value then and there, and then he backs that up with 2 genuinely good boosts to his own unit, plus a good melee profile. He gives his squad a 4+ invulnerable save, which is very nice for any 3+ save Space Marines out of just literally any of them. It's perhaps particularly interesting for Inner Circle companions if you wanted to make them work, given that it makes them an actual somewhat tanky unit with their -1 to hit, but you can just have some fairly tough Hellblasters or Assault Intercessors or something as well. The Sustained Hits 1 helps out basically any Space Marine unit that he's attached to as well, just a lot of extra damage there, and that'll help out his own attacks too. And then he's got some good threat in melee with 6 attacks at strength 6 AP4 and damage 2 with devastating wounds, should be some threats to anything he touches in combat. plus a fearsome combi weapon with 3 shots at close in the Lion's Wrath, and even a bonus Watcher in the Dark for a once per game mortal wound defense. At 105 points, realistically, is kind of undercosted for what he does. Basically, auto-includes to the point of being in just about every optimized list. It's got loads of choice for good squad options to lead as well. As mentioned, Assault Intercessors are nice if you want to keep him cheap. Them granting him the rerolls on objectives can be big with devastating wounds. And Hellblasters really like both his damage and defense, and they can be a pretty fearsome shooting unit with him. Certainly could be alright with Stern Guard, Intercessors, Inner Circle Companions, or even Blade Guard. Kind of a shame that he can't lead company heroes anymore though, as his invulnerable save was also nice for them. Otherwise, we have the Ravenwing Darkshroud Landspeeder with the Shrine of Old Caliban. 115 points, basically for a cheapish vehicle that gives you an aura of stealth and cover. The idea is that hopefully you put this next to the units that are going to take the most enemy firepower next turn. Particularly helpful for things like vehicles that want to be adventurous and move up the board, often classically being used with Storm Ravens and Dreadnoughts jumping out of them in an Ironstorm spearhead, so those 3 vehicles can move into a really threatening position, unleash a whole load of good damage with the Ironstorm stratagems and boosts and things, and then compared with what you'd expect, they'd be far tougher to take down in return with firepower, if they're still going to get cover in a good position and -1 to hit on top of that, and then use Armour of Contempt on whatever the enemy is trying to go after. Even if not doing that entire Stormraven Rush sort of manoeuvre, it's certainly not too bad with some of the more normal gun tank profiles of the Space Marines as well, maybe things like Land Raider Redeemers, Repulsor Executioners, Vindicators, or Gladiators. Ideally, it might want a turn or two handing out its buffs to nearby units to make sure they don't get killed too early too easily. And later in the game, once the buff might not be quite as important, you've got a 14-inch move, toughness 8, 10 wound vehicle with a 5+ invulnerable save, which given its own inbuilt durability rules really isn't too bad for 115 points, even if it doesn't have too much threat with its heavy bolter or assault cannon. And you can just use that as a nuisance or trading type unit, maybe moving up fast to do annoyance charges or jump on objectives and things. Hopefully you've already got enough value out of its anti-shooting type rules, and then anything else that it does is added value and it can be quite expendable. With Azrael and the Landspeeder in mind, even compared with most Space Marine datasheets, I feel like the Ironstorm ones perhaps have a special relevance in Tier 1 here. Azrael generates you more command points to use the Ironstorm's excellent stratagems, particularly Mercier's weakness and Armour of Contempt when hit back, though there's plenty of other fun ones, and the Dark Shroud can be lurking around to make the most important element of your army tougher. As mentioned, have the Stormspeeder swoop in, light up the enemy with a whole bunch of scary gun profiles, and drop off a Redemptor Dreadnought to do the same. Then they'll be hard to kill in return, and just other things for that detachment are things like Land Raider Redeemers, Gladiator Lancers and Reapers, the Repulsor Executioner, the Vindicator, maybe the Ballistus Dreadnought, and perhaps a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike to mark vehicles for +1 to wounds. Otherwise, here are some of the other Space Marine datasheets I'd consider kind of top tier just for their datasheet type rules. Scouts and Infiltrators are 2 of the most auto-include Space Marine units out there. Cheap screening in the midfield for scout squads, and genuinely not awful damage and defense as well. Infiltrators can deny deep strike, often sat on a home objective to protect that against all comers unless the opponent doesn't have any reserves. Inceptors pay a premium for their 3-inch drop, but can be handy to have maybe a unit or 2 around to basically guarantee secondaries or do a big hit on something that should otherwise be safe. Eradicators have really strong anti-armor damage, though they need delivery, maybe best in the Gladius or the Firestorm perhaps. Hellblasters are just efficient, scary, and hard to go too far wrong with. They enjoy Grandmaster Azrael in particular. Jump Intercessors for 80 points are cheap and effective scoring units and can skirmish with their counterparts in the enemy pretty hard with a Power Fist and Mortal Wound impact hits. And then just 4 reliable characters that rarely are a bad choice for a unit. The Lieutenant and the Apothecary Biologist are great with their lethal hits for their units. Can be great for some big all-in combos out of Land Raider Redeemers perhaps. And the Tech Marine's really nice if you've got any big amount of vehicles, as Dark Angels Ironstorm might often have at a competitive level. Kind of fine in other detachments, but stand out there where you need them to bear the great enhancements as well as what they do normally. In any case, certainly feels like Dark Angels are in a bit of a weird place at time of recording. At a more competitive level, I'm sure it's not what most people want to see Azrael and a Dark Shroud leading a bunch of tanks around, though casually I feel like after the latest batch of points reductions, a bunch of their more standard elite damage dealers really aren't so bad anymore. Both the Deathwing, Ravenwing and Lionel Johnson can be scary, though a lot of their other supporting characters and vehicles are a bit mid at best. Will be interesting to see if Games Workshop does anything good for them in the balanced data slate. I feel like some buffs to the Dark Angel's unique detachments would be pretty well in order. It certainly feels like the Inner Circle companions have some room for improvement. In any case, look forward to hearing your thoughts. How do you rate the Dark Angels units in the Codex right now, and would you rate anything higher or lower? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones every day. And if you were interested in any 3D printed parts that could be compatible for the Dark Angels, feel free to check out those black lions for the channel's video sponsor, links down in the video description. Otherwise, if you'd like to support the channel and help keep these videos coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.